Dim the lights, maybe put on a kettle, perhaps the sort that sighs rather than whistles. Settle in under a blanket that smells faintly of lavender and books. If you have a cat, this is its cue to sit, directly on your chest. Tonight, we are peeling back the whisper-thin veil that separates ink from intention, and secrets from stains. A story not about battles or kings. No. This is a tale of lemon juice, love notes, and longing. Of invisible ink, and the lovers who wielded it with all the subtlety of a catapult in a greenhouse. You see, before emojis, before texting you up at 2 a.m., and even before the wildly inefficient telegram, there was the letter. A humble sheet of parchment, perhaps perfumed with rosemary if the sender was trying to impress, or cabbage water if they were just doing their best. And in some of these letters was something more. Invisible ink, the literary equivalent of a whisper in the dark. But let us wander back further, much further, to the medieval scriptoriums and candlelit corners of Europe, where monks hunched like commas over manuscripts, and somewhere, an alchemist with too much time and not enough supervision decided that messages should be hidden, not just written. It started simply. Substances from the kitchen cupboard. Lemon juice, vinegar, milk. Innocent ingredients used not for cooking, but for concealing declarations of war or declarations of love. More often the latter, and more often than that, terribly written. The science, if we can call it that, was charmingly primitive. Write a message using lemon juice. Let it dry. The words vanish, leaving behind only the faint memory of your bad handwriting. Then, when heated, say by holding it over a candle or placing it lovingly atop a freshly baked pie, the message reappears. A miracle, or at least a party trick with feelings. And so began an era of clandestine communication, of messages written in silence and decoded in fire. It was, in essence, a secret language between two souls, though one often slightly more invested than the other. Now, dear listener, imagine it is the year 1432. Somewhere in southern France, a young noblewoman, let's call her Isabeau, because of course, sits by her chamber window. The sun is dripping gold through the shutters. She pens a letter to her forbidden love, whose name is probably Etienne, because again, of course. Their families are feuding over something trivial, like sheep taxes or someone's uncle being rude at dinner, and so their love must be hidden, not just metaphorically but chemically. She dips a feather quill into lemon juice, the pulp still clinging to the edge of her cup. She writes, "My heart, like this message, is hidden, but it burns when near you." A solid line, Isabeau. Dramatic, poetic, ever so slightly flammable. She lets it dry, sprinkles some lavender in the envelope to really set the mood, and sends it by courier. Likely a boy named Luc, with a lazy eye and a sincere lack of urgency. Days pass. Etienne receives it. He opens it, sees nothing, assumes it's either a very bold statement or that Isabeau has simply ghosted him via parchment. He doesn't think to warm it. This, dear friends, is how many medieval romances faded into obscurity, because one or both parties forgot how science worked, or to be fair, didn't know in the first place. Invisible ink was the love language of the bold and the baffled, a tool of romance, espionage, and absolutely avoidable misunderstandings. But don't worry, we've only just begun. There are many more invisible hearts to reveal, and even more smudged endings to mourn. So lean in and let's continue. After another cup of imaginary tea, let's drift onward, gently now, like a love note caught in a breeze that can't decide where it's going. We've already peeked into the lemon-scented corners of Isabeau and Etienne's heartbreak. Lost, not to fate, but to poor thermal technique. But our tale of invisible ink is far from invisible history. In fact, as we trudge delicately through time, we discover that secrecy, like fashion, tends to recycle itself in increasingly dramatic ways. By the 16th century, invisible ink had graduated from the hands of hopeless romantics and into the trembling fingers of political spies, which, as you can imagine, made the stakes a touch higher than unrequited love. The ink remained homemade, concocted with vinegar, wine, onion juice, or even urine, though I recommend not mixing those ingredients unless you're attempting both espionage and plague. Still, it was the Renaissance, and people were drunk on enlightenment and arsenic, often simultaneously. Secrets were currency, and ink was the vault. Take, for instance, the delightful chaos of Queen Elizabeth I's court. Somewhere amidst the powdered wigs, political backstabbing, and suspiciously fast-acting illnesses, secret messages flitted about like moths in a library. Letters written in invisible ink were hidden between diplomatic reports, inside book bindings, even on the undersides of playing cards. Of course, one of the biggest problems with invisible ink, besides its tendency to fade or go completely undetected by the less observant, is that it only works if the recipient knows it's there. Many a message went forever unread, mistaken for a blank page or worse, repurposed as a grocery list. But every so often it worked. And oh, when it worked. Enter John Gerard. Not a lover, but a Jesuit priest in the late 1500s who was imprisoned in the Tower of London for doing exactly what England didn't want Jesuit priests doing, existing. Gerard, clever thing that he was, used orange juice to write secret correspondence to his followers. His messages were embedded in the margins of letters that looked innocuous, just a note about someone's health or a shipment of flour. But between the lines, literally, were instructions for smuggling priests across the countryside. You could call it divine citrus intervention. Eventually, he escaped the tower by sliding down a rope across the moat, not relevant to ink, but frankly too cinematic to leave out. A true icon. And yet, even as invisible ink blossomed into an art form of espionage and political flirtation, romance remained its most tragic and frequent casualty. Because love, dear listener, makes people do ridiculous things, especially when they have access to household acids. One such tale, though likely apocryphal, and therefore perfect for bedtime, is of a German baroness who fell in love with a soldier stationed miles away. She sent him dozens of letters, each coated in milk-based ink and riddled with passionate declarations. Unfortunately, he was lactose intolerant. That's not the reason he didn't reply, but it does add a certain poetic cruelty to the silence. In truth, he had never received the letters. A maid, seeing nothing on the pages, had used them to kindle the fireplace during a particularly harsh winter, and so the Baroness's burning heart ended up literally keeping someone warm. You see, history is full of tiny ironies like this. Lovers misreading silence. Letters that combusted before they could console. Science that outpaced sentiment. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Invisible ink, while technically impressive, was not known for its reliability. Sometimes the ink faded before it could be read. Sometimes it reacted with the paper and turned brown. And sometimes, most tragically of all, it simply never reached its destination. Lost to weather, war, or someone using it as a napkin. But the lovers kept writing. Because that's what lovers do, even when they shouldn't. We're only halfway through our lemon-scented labyrinth, dear dreamer. There are royal scandals still hidden between blank lines, secret societies whispering in vinegar, and one particular Russian empress who used invisible ink for reasons that remain questionable. We'll get to her soon, but first let's pause, stretch your toes, sip something warm, and remember that even the most invisible ink can leave the deepest marks, if only in memory. And so we drift, softer still, into a world where ink evaporates and intentions linger, where blank paper may be more dangerous than the loudest decree, where love and war both hide behind the same invisible veil, one of citrus and secrecy. Now, as promised, let's tiptoe, gently, like a librarian after hours, into the court of Catherine the Great. Yes, the Empress of Russia. She of the legendary ambition, relentless reform, and rumored appetites. But what you may not know is that Catherine had a particular fondness for coded correspondence. In an age where monarchs could barely trust their own mirrors, she wasn't about to send a standard wish-you-were-here scroll across hostile territory without at least a few chemical tricks. Enter invisible ink. Her scribes were equipped with recipes that included cobalt salts, starch, and occasionally, urine. It seems no one in the 18th century was above weaponizing their bodily fluids for the sake of discretion. Historians still argue about the content of some of her secret messages. Some say they were love letters to her many, many lovers. Others insist they were orders to spies or manifestos on Enlightenment ideals. Or perhaps all of the above within the same note, depending on how much heat you applied. Imagine a letter that says, "I miss your lips until you warm it near a fire," and then suddenly adds, "and increase grain tariffs immediately." Romance and economics. She truly was a multitasker. But Catherine wasn't alone. Secret societies and underground thinkers across Europe had started embracing invisible ink with almost poetic fervor. The Rosicrucians, a rather mysterious brotherhood of mystics, were rumored to use invisible ink made from alum and gallic acid. These were men who believed the universe could be unlocked with the right combination of symbols, starlight, and mildly toxic substances. They didn't always have a reason to write invisible messages, but they enjoyed knowing that they could, which is, in a way, the most human trait of all. In France, meanwhile, during the heat wave of revolution and rebellion, invisible ink became almost fashionably paranoid. The Jacobins suspected the Girondins suspected the aristocracy, and everyone suspected the mailman. Entire treaties were drafted in what appeared to be blank parchment, causing no small amount of confusion when someone spilled soup and revealed a full-blown assassination plan beneath their lunch. But even amidst all the drama, empresses, revolutions, mystic circles with poor impulse control, it was always the lovers who used invisible ink with the most chaotic sincerity. One such duo, a schoolteacher and a local poet in Vienna, circa 1792. Their names are lost to time, but their letters remain in fragments, preserved in a monastery's archives, tucked beneath ledgers of cheese purchases. He called her his secret muse. She called him a poet with a very confused sense of metaphor. He would write, "My words to you hide like shadows behind moonlight." She would reply, presumably after warming the page over a lamp, "Please stop using milk, it smells." It wasn't quite Shakespeare, but it was earnest and fragile and deeply human. These small, clumsy romances, hidden between the folds of daily life, tell us more about the past than any royal decree. Because invisible ink, dear dreamer, was not just a tool. It was a gesture, a risk, a small act of hope dipped in lemon juice. But as more and more people began to rely on invisible ink, governments took notice. And they did what governments always do when people have fun. They regulated it. By the early 1800s, major European powers had entire departments dedicated to decoding secret inks. The British Admiralty in particular took this very seriously. One could even say too seriously. They tested over 100 substances, including onion juice, tobacco water, and oddly enough, crushed wasps, in their quest to defeat invisible messages. Their official guidebook read more like a wizard's journal than a military manual. Yet even with all this innovation, the fundamental problem remained. For every brilliant scientist making the ink, there were at least 3 confused recipients who set their letters on fire while trying to read them. But perhaps that's part of the charm. Invisible ink was always less about secrecy and more about faith. Faith that the message would survive, that the reader would know what to do, that heat would reveal, not destroy, that love, however faint, would become visible with time. And isn't that the most quietly romantic idea of all? By now, dear listener, we are comfortably tangled in the pale threads of history's softest secrets. You've warmed your tea, perhaps changed into socks with little moons on them, and the cat, if you have one, has become a furry anchor upon your chest. Good. Let's continue. As the 19th century ambled in, wearing a waistcoat, a monocle, and a suspicious amount of facial hair, the use of invisible ink became less the domain of poets and paramours, and more the serious business of empire. The British, as they often did, took things a bit too far. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British War Office developed sympathetic ink bureaus, which sounds charming, doesn't it? As if the ink were emotionally available. But no, these were departments that produced invisible inks in bulk. Vast quantities of what looked like plain water, but could hold entire supply routes, battle strategies, or requests for more jam. Napoleon's forces, not to be outdone, used their own version, sometimes lemon juice, sometimes rice water. Occasionally, they'd hide entire letters inside hollowed-out loaves of bread, and once, rather famously, sewn into the lining of a live goose. The goose was deeply uncooperative. These messages were often destined for generals. But in between the battle plans were always fragments of longing. Because even war cannot stop people from missing each other. One soldier in Napoleon's ranks, a cavalryman named Louis, because of course, wrote to his wife back in Marseille using rice water ink. His message was folded into a piece of plain-looking parchment and hidden within a false heel of his boot. When discovered by British soldiers, it seemed blank. They used it to wipe oil off a cannon. It was only years later, found again in a military archive, that someone noticed the faint sheen of ghostly script. The message, when finally coaxed back to life with iodine fumes, read, "I cannot remember your face, only how my chest hurt when I left you." War, you see, is many things, but it is always also the sound of someone whispering goodbye into paper. And then, as we roll gently into the Victorian era, an age of corsets, caution, and deeply repressed emotions, the popularity of invisible ink did not fade. Quite the opposite. Victorians adored a secret. They adored rules even more, and thus the joy of breaking them. It was during this era that young ladies began writing invisible notes, not just to lovers, but to each other. Friendships, often more intense than romance, were nurtured beneath layers of etiquette and starch. Girls at finishing schools would pass blank letters during piano recitals or under the watchful eye of a chaperone, the ink made from diluted alum or onion juice. One such girl, Beatrice of Devonshire, wrote a dozen such letters to her closest friend, Clara. The contents, once revealed, were charmingly domestic. "Miss Longwell says I must practice embroidery, but I have begun sewing little rude words into my cuffs instead." And in another, "If I must marry Lord Pembroke, I may simply expire. He has 3 teeth and smells of coins." Bless you, Beatrice. Invisible ink became a quiet act of rebellion against parents, suitors, society. An invisible sigh written onto a world that didn't ask how you felt. And though the technology of invisible ink continued to evolve, the hearts behind it stayed the same. Hopeful, messy, slightly unhinged. But not all stories end in giggles and geese. During the American Civil War, both Union and Confederate spies employed invisible ink extensively. One particularly ill-fated Confederate spy attempted to send a message in sympathetic ink hidden inside a fake recipe book. Unfortunately, the book was confiscated by a Union officer with a great passion for cooking and a tragically powerful stove. It burst into flames, and the message? Gone, along with the recipe for molasses cookies. Now then, soft traveler of the past, let us step, quietly like a diplomat with a hangover, into the 20th century, where the art of invisible ink was about to be transformed by war, science, and the particularly suspicious minds of Cold War operatives who trusted no one, not even their stationery. By now the world had become noisier. Cars honked, radios buzzed, the telegram had come and gone. But hidden beneath this din, the practice of sending secrets on the breath of a page was alive and twitching, albeit more sophisticated. Less lemon juice, more chemistry sets. World War I introduced invisible ink to the world of trench coats and trench warfare. The British intelligence agency, Room 40, which sounds like a mysterious wardrobe but was in fact a very serious cryptographic office, began experimenting with gallatanic acid and sodium nitrate. These weren't exactly items you could pick up at the apothecary, unless your apothecary was very understanding and had a dark past. And the Germans? They used sympathetic inks composed of cobalt salts that turned blue under heat. Blue being a very trustworthy color, until it started spelling out things like attack at dawn, or do not trust the man with the mustache. One of the more famous cases of this period was a spy named Fritz Duquesne, whose passion for invisible messages was rivaled only by his flair for dramatic aliases. Posing as everything from a war correspondent to a big game hunter, both of which allowed him access to very dangerous places, Duquesne wrote his messages in invisible ink between lines of newspaper columns. If you read it aloud without knowing better, you'd think he was ranting about giraffes. But if you warmed it up, maps, coordinates, entire sabotage plans hidden between stories about spotted cats. Now, there's something undeniably poetic about hiding dangerous truths inside something as flimsy as newsprint. It's a bit like concealing a knife inside a pancake. Then came World War II, and with it, the golden age of invisible ink, or perhaps the ultraviolet age. This was a time of invention and paranoia. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, precursor to the CIA, turned invisible ink from a hobby into a full-blown science. They created ink that only appeared under ultraviolet light, others that would show up only after exposure to particular chemicals. Some changed color twice, as if to say, "Oh, you thought that was the secret? Just kidding." Even more impressive, they developed inks that could only be developed with the right developing fluid and under specific conditions, like humidity, temperature, or proximity to someone named Harold. Okay, not the last one. Probably. British intelligence, not to be outdone, developed marking ink number 4, a substance so powerful it could be used on clothing, paper, or even human skin. Not that they recommended writing national secrets on one's forearm, but someone almost certainly tried. These inks were passed between agents in ordinary-looking books, disguised medicine bottles, and sometimes even toothpaste tubes. In fact, one OSS agent hid an entire set of invisible ink instructions inside a fake toothpaste label that, once decoded, began with the immortal line, "Brush twice daily, or the fascists win." Even the Soviets, stern-faced and fond of trench coats, even when unnecessary, had their own invisible ink program. Messages were sometimes written inside shoes, between the sole and the insole. Yes, literal soul-searching. One particular pair of shoes, intercepted at a checkpoint in Vienna, revealed the location of 3 Soviet assets and the recipe for borscht, which raises the eternal question, was it espionage or dinner plans? But perhaps the most deliciously absurd moment of all came during the Cold War. A CIA operative in Berlin sent a message using an ink that only became visible when rubbed with raw potato. That's right, potato. The agent receiving the message, a charmingly flustered man named Hal, misunderstood the instructions and instead baked the potato, covered it in sour cream, and ate it. The message, sadly, was lost. Hal later described it as the most fulfilling mistake of my career. By this point, invisible ink had become so complex that even trained agents sometimes couldn't decipher their own messages. A memo discovered years later in a CIA archive reads, "Note, Agent Bravo must stop using vodka as developing solution. Results are unreliable, and the reports become flammable." Now, you may be wondering, why go through all this trouble? Why not simply encrypt a message digitally? Well, dear listener, because digital messages don't smell faintly of lemons, or arrive folded in a coat pocket, or carry with them the romantic anxiety of maybe nothing is actually written here at all. Invisible ink, like love and regret, lives somewhere between presence and absence. It says, "I trust that you'll find me here, hidden between the lines," and that perhaps is the greatest magic of all. And now, gentle traveler of time and tea, we come toward the end of our parchment trail. The wars have cooled. The spies have put away their pens and their potatoes. The Cold War has melted slightly, and the world, now a tapestry of digital signals and glowing screens, no longer needs to dip its secrets in lemon juice or tuck confessions into the cuffs of silk shirts. And yet, invisible ink remains. Not as a necessity, but as nostalgia, as ritual, as something absurd and lovely and unnecessary in all the best ways. The art of hiding and revealing, of speaking through silence, has simply changed forms, but it hasn't left us. In fact, you can still find invisible ink being used today. In modern spycraft, yes, but also by artists, schoolchildren, magicians, protesters, pranksters, and even very optimistic lovers. In 2012, a couple in Massachusetts exchanged wedding vows written in ultraviolet ink. The words were blank until they pulled out a blacklight during the ceremony, which must have looked incredibly romantic, or like a police investigation, depending on how you stage it. Meanwhile, in South Korea, some protesters used invisible ink on signs and banners to evade censorship. When viewed under UV light, the real messages appeared. Silent resistance, glowing like a whispered scream. And then there's a small museum in the Netherlands, charmingly titled Het Museum van Verborgen Brieven, or the Museum of Hidden Letters, which houses a collection of 17th to 20th century letters written in invisible ink. Visitors can examine blank-looking envelopes and then, under soft UV lamps, watch the secrets bloom across the pages like ghosts waking up from a nap. One of the letters, written by a British nurse to her sister in 1917, includes a secret postscript. "If the war doesn't end, I shall marry the baker and become entirely bread." Another, written by a teenage girl in Prague in 1941, simply says, "They don't know I'm writing this, but I'm still here." And then, there is one last letter. The ink now faded, the paper fragile. But under the right light, with the right patience, a single sentence appears. "You never replied. I'm warming this again, just in case." There's something almost unbearable about that. Because for all the cleverness, the chemistry, the geopolitics, invisible ink was always most powerful in the hands of those who feared they'd be forgotten. Those who believed, against the odds, that their words would matter to someone, eventually. That someone would hold their letter over a candle. That someone would care enough to try. And so we end, not with an explosion or a scandal, but with the faintest of hopes. The idea that even what is hidden may yet be seen. That even a blank page can hold the weight of love, or grief, or revolution, or a really bad pun. Today, of course, we have encryption algorithms and cloud storage, but none of it is quite as romantic as a letter that requires a little fire to speak. So maybe tonight, when the world is quiet and the tea is cooling, you'll write something yourself. Perhaps a note, a thought, a memory, and maybe you'll dip a toothpick in lemon juice, scrawl it across a napkin and set it aside, invisible, silent, waiting, and maybe, someday, someone will warm it and see you. And so we arrive. At the edge of the page, the candle has burned low. Your tea, once heroic, is now tepid. Perhaps even finished. The cat has left, offended by your sudden emotional vulnerability. And all around us, history lies folded, creased like a love note in a coat pocket, forgotten and sweet. What began as a lemon-scented accident of science became something more. A language of longing, a method of survival, a way to say I am here, even when you couldn't be, even when it wasn't safe to speak, even when silence was your only choice. Invisible ink may no longer be essential, but it is still beautiful, because it trusts in a reader who may never come. It gambles on warmth, it believes in revelation, and perhaps that's the thread running through every story we've unwrapped tonight, that we are all, in some way, letters waiting to be opened, that we all carry invisible lines inside us, written in joy, or grief, or mischief, that long for someone else to lean in and read between them. So the next time you find yourself staring at a blank page, or a quiet room, or an unread message. Remember this strange and gentle history. Remember Isabeau and Etienne. Remember Beatrice, who embroidered insults into her cuffs. Remember the borscht map, the spy who ate the potato, the ghost letters blooming under violet light. And remember, sometimes what matters most is hidden. Sometimes it takes heat to reveal what's always been there. Sometimes love needs to be warmed before it can be read. So dim the lights. Put on the kettle. Again, if you must. And maybe, just maybe, pick up a pen. Not to write what must be seen, but to whisper what might one day be found. Because someone, somewhere, may still be holding your message over a candle, waiting.